So up to this point, for those of you that have been here for a while, we have talked specifically about what I call outside evidence. Evidence that is around us in the universe that can be interpreted in two different ways. It can be interpreted that we got here by accident, or it can be interpreted as we got here through a mind that created things, started things in motion. We said that there are some people, like hopefully pretty much everybody in this room believes that that is God, but there are others that think it's other things. Not that it was here by accident, but that there was some kind of mind and they defined it in different ways. We're going to talk about some of those as this class progresses in this second half, because this second half has to do with what I call internal or inside evidence. That's what we're starting today. And that has to do with, okay, if we believe that there is a mind, and that that mind is the personality or thing that started everything that we see in the universe, whether it's the trees and the earth and the planets, or whether it's life itself, if we see it that it didn't start by accident, but by mind instead, what is that mind? Okay, because like we talked about last week, for a lot of people, that doesn't automatically mean to them that the God of the Bible is the one that started it. Right? And that's important to understand, because you can talk to people about, yeah, I don't think that the universe came by accident. And you don't think, in other words, you and someone else can be talking like that and not even know that you believe in the God of the Bible and they believe in something totally different, and you're still in agreement on that. Okay, how do we tell? Some people think that it doesn't matter. You can believe in the God of the Bible, I can believe in this, but they're all the same. The question is, are they? Okay, I'm going to challenge you to think differently about this and to come to a conclusion, hopefully by the evidence, that it is the God of the Bible. But if it is, there should be a way we should be able to tell. And there's lots and lots of evidence I'm going to present over the next several weeks that's going to get into that. But it's still all based on, like we said before, it's not provable. Okay? Can we prove that there's a God? We said no. Can we prove that evolution is either true or false? The answer is no, we can't. We have to look at the evidence, and the evolutionist and the person that believes in the Bible are looking at the same evidence. That's what that whole first half that we just got done with is about. We look at the evidence. Where does it go? How do we interpret it? That's what that whole series has been about for like 16, 17 weeks. Now we're going to do the same sort of thing with, what is that mind? Is it the one that the Bible describes, or is it something else? Or does it matter? So, first thing we're going to get into today. How do you know if something is true or false? And I don't care what right now, but are there ways you can tell for positive whether something is true or whether something is false? How?
You look at it, use your eyes, determine.
You can't be fooled?
Well, yeah, you can.
So you can't tell for sure sometimes.
I guess that's true.
That is true. Mm-hmm. You cannot tell for sure whether something is true or false sometimes. All right? How do you know if a book is true or false? I mean, you can go to the library and you can look into nonfiction and go, these ones are all true, and then you can look into fiction and think that these ones are all false. But let's say it's about history. Do we know for sure that the person that wrote the history book didn't have a bias and put things in there that's not right because he wants it to be looked at a certain way? It happens all the time. All right? So what I'm trying to tell you is it's extremely difficult sometimes. We accept that if somebody says this is a history book or this is a nonfiction book, we just assume that it's right. That's not always true. And even if most of it's true, sometimes some of it's not. Okay? Have you ever watched a movie that's historical? What does it usually say at the beginning of these movies? Does it say every single thing in here is a fact exactly the way it happened? What does it say?
Based on historical events.
Based on what does that mean? What does it mean to say based on historical events?
It's written about it, but not everything is true to what happened.
They didn't put it necessarily in the right order. I find that I'm constantly on my phone when I'm watching certain things. That didn't happen at that time. This happened first and this happened second, and they got it flip-flopped. These happened 30, 40, 50 years apart, and they got them happening on the same day. This didn't really happen. They're just using this as a literary device to get to the point that they want. So how do we know for sure what is true and what is false? It is difficult because we're fed a lot of things as truth that are not truth. Okay? It's very common, way more common than we think it is. How do we know if a historical event itself is even true? All right? I learned when I was growing up that George Washington cut down the cherry tree. Now they're saying that didn't even happen. But it was told for decades, if not a century, that happened. Now they say it's not even true. I believed it. Okay? Bigger things than that, more important things than that, this happens to be this way a lot over time. So, here is some ways that we can tell whether something historical is based on truth or whether it's actually true or whether it's not even true. These are a few things right here. All right, so first of all, we can examine primary sources. What are primary sources?
Eyewitnesses, right?
Eyewitnesses would be one.
Coming directly from the person who's writing it.
Coming directly from the
Person and stuff out.
not necessarily, because a lot of times the people that are writing it are not writing it down as it happens.
Oh, you're right. They're looking in.
Okay? You got to be careful. You really do. But you can go to sources of people that saw it at the same time it was happening, or at least heard it firsthand from another person. Okay? You can study letters and diaries, and nowadays you can study photographs and recordings. You could look at official records of the time to find out whether something happened. In archaeology, one of the things they look at is pottery. Okay? Because pottery, I mean, I had a series once I did, I might show you this later when we get into it, where there's two different American style potteries. One of them is, if you look at it closely, back in the 1700s. Patterns are like that. What it's made out of is like that. The other one is, I think they call it Melmac. It wasn't even made till the 1960s. So that something couldn't have happened in the 1700s if it had Melmac in the scene. Okay? Lots of things like that give us clues. The kinds of names, we're actually going to watch a whole video on the kinds of names that are used. If a person writes something in history and doesn't know enough to use the correct kinds of names that they chose at that time period, it's probably not right. And we're going to see evidence that that's true between what's called the Gnostic Gospels, who use names that are not even close to the ones used at biblical times, and the Gospels themselves, who are extremely accurate as to the Greek names that happened back during the time of Jesus. Okay? We examine secondary sources. Secondary sources are accounts that identify, it's the wrong page. Accounts or interpretations of historical events created by historians and other scholars based on the primary sources. So, in the case of the Bible, not only do we have the entire Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts all the way through in the New Testament, but 100 years later, 200 years later, we have guys that are quoting the Bible so that we could actually put together, if we didn't have an original of the Bible, we can go to those guys that wrote 100 and 200 years later, and we can find every single verse in the Bible because they've used it in their literature. Okay? Secondary sources. What kinds of things do they write about?
Would Luke be considered a secondary source since he wasn't an eyewitness to Christ, but heard from the disciples?
That's kind of a tricky one because he did live at the time of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know whether or not he saw Jesus.
Okay.
Okay? We don't know. So in a sense, he's either one or the other, or maybe both.
Gotcha.
Okay? We're going to get into Luke. Luke is one of the more important ones we're going to talk about.
Cool. Okay.
But that's an excellent question. What about cross-references? Can we compare accounts from multiple sources to identify inconsistencies or biases? In other words, if we read this source, this source, this source, this source, and this one that we think is correct is different than every other source that we read from the time, this one's kind of suspect. All right? Look for biases. Like my dad once told me, everybody has their own point of view. And if you don't know the author's bias, if you don't know what the author believes when he writes that, you don't know where to look for the things that he's trying to emphasize that are either not true, exaggerated, or downplayed. Right? For instance, the Egyptian people, the ancient Egyptians, when they wrote, they never did anything in their writings to make the Pharaoh look bad. All right? So if they had a defeat, they usually didn't write about it.
Mm-hmm.
Or they wrote something positive. So you got these obelisks going up, and on the side of them is like whole things about whatever battles they had, so the public could come and read them, you know. And you'd only read the good stuff. You'd never read any of the bad stuff. You got to look at the context, understanding the historical and social and political context of an event. This is crucial for interpreting the evidence and drawing accurate conclusions. I used to read political comics, okay? I don't know why. As a late teenager, early 20s, I thought they were fascinating. Then I went into college, and I remember looking at books that were history books or political science books, and they had political comics that might have been from the 1800s or the 1700s or the 1600s. Guess what? I didn't understand them. Why? Because I'm not familiar with the context. I had no idea what was going on back then. Here is a example. And I don't know if you guys have heard me say this before or not, but I'm going to say it again just in case. What's the Wizard of Oz about? You be quiet.
It's a lot of different perspectives.
Well, what do you think? What do you think? Well, just name me one you think that it's about. It doesn't matter what it is. Just something simple.
Following the yellow brick road.
Okay? All right. Anybody else? It was actually written in the late 1800s by a guy named, forgot his name. Doesn't matter, okay? Doesn't matter. It's political. It's a book that was written as a children's book for adults, kind of like Bugs Bunny was. Bugs Bunny was for kids to watch, but if you watch it carefully, there's a lot of humor in Bugs Bunny that if you're not an adult living at that time, you don't get. Okay? It's over their heads. That's the way The Wizard of Oz was written, about a problem that was going on at the time that had to do with the silver and the gold standard. The original story is not about some fantasy kid going around in a place where she doesn't live and finding this yellow brick road. The yellow brick road stands for the gold standard. Her original shoes were not ruby slippers, they were silver slippers for the silver standard. The Wizard of Oz, OZ stands for ounce. That's the abbreviation. Ounce is the standard for gold and silver. And every single character in that book and in that original book and in that movie stand for something at that time. The Cowardly Lion stood for Williams Jennings Bryan, running for president at the time. Okay? The Tin Man stood for the industrial base. Straw Man stood for the farmer. Even at the Everyman, which was Dorothy herself, was a character. Toto. I don't remember exactly what his part was, but he was a character. Each one of the witches. And the Emerald City and the guy standing behind the curtain, that was Washington, D.C. Why was it that he didn't want them to peek behind the curtain? Because they were trying to cover up what they were doing. It's a totally different story than you think. If you didn't live at that time, you don't know that. Now it's just a kid's story. All right? So we have to understand context. And we have to be able to look at archaeological evidence. I'll give you one quick example before we move on, because I want to make sure we get through a lot more of this. There is a big discrepancy, we're going to talk in detail about this, between when Jericho fell. They know Jericho fell. They know that there's evidence that looks like the walls fell the same way the Bible says they fall. But when Catherine Kenron went in there, I forget which year, was it the 50s or the 60s? I have to look that up again. She based her idea that it didn't happen when the Bible said it happened on the pottery that she found inside the city that had been burned. But another guy came in years later and he found that there was a problem with the level that she was at, and that the pottery that she found was actually probably imported from another place, and that the dates actually line up with the Bible dates. But guess now, because the evolutionists, like we talked about in the first part of this class, want to make sure that the Bible isn't accurate, they still go with Catherine Kenyon's analogy, because it fits their narrative. There's a lot of this little kinds of evidence sometimes that if we don't look into, we just go along and go, well, it couldn't have been, so the Bible was wrong. Not necessarily. So, which of these kinds of statements do you think best describes the Bible? I want you to pick one. Everybody pick one. Then I'm going to ask. We've got the Bible is a history book, the Bible is a science book, the Bible is a geography book, the Bible is a book of various kinds of literature. The Bible is a book filled with rules, good morals, tells us how to live, so it's tells us about God's wrath, it tells us about God's love. Everybody got one they think that best describes it? Okay. Give me one.
Me?
Yeah.
I gotta go with various kinds of literature.
Okay. All right. What do you think?
I went with it tells us about God's wrath.
Okay. Anybody else want to volunteer? What you got? You'd actually have the correct answer. Because basically the Bible has all of that in there, but that's not what it's about. It has every one of those things in there. And when it talks about it, it's accurate. So we're going to look at the history part. We're going to look at the science part. We're going to look at the geography part. We're going to look at the literature part. We're going to look at some of these other things. But that's not what the Bible is about. And that's where a lot of people make a huge mistake. So how can we prove that the Bible is true? Or can we even prove that the Bible is true? The Bible is written in such a way that it makes the claim that it is true. Now this is important, because there's a lot of people that say, yeah, but the Bible and Jesus, they're kind of the same as Buddha, and they're kind of the same as Krishna, and they're kind of the, all these other different kinds of religions. But the Bible doesn't make that claim. The Bible makes a claim where it is the truth. Whether it's 2 Timothy 3, where it says all scripture is God-breathed. God says these things for truth. Sanctify them by the truth of my word. Your word is truth. Talking about the idea, I think this is Jesus speaking here. Yeah, it's John speaking here. He's talking about God. The words are true. Okay? Talking about the entire Bible. Every word of God but proves true, according to Proverbs. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God. That's what we live by, because it's true. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. In fact, Jesus is in front of Pilate just before he's going to be crucified. And Jesus makes a claim like this, and Pilate looks at him and goes, what is truth? Because not only do people today figure that they can't find truth, they couldn't find it back during Jesus' time either, because they didn't believe that the God of the Bible was true and that Jesus was the truth. If that's the case, then everything else is wrong and it's the only true book. That's a big claim. How can we get there? If the Bible is not primarily a history book, a science book, geography book, literature book, a book of rules and a book of morals, and it's not primarily a book that tells us how to live, and it's not a book primarily about God's wrath or God's love, then the question is, what kind of book is it? Because it claims to be true, it has to be some kind of a book that makes that claim. And what I'm going to try to do today, and I've done this in other classes before, is compare it to a 3-act play. We're going to use this periodically throughout some of these sessions, all right, over the next few weeks. Periodically, you're going to see this pop up. Now, this kind of structure, the 3-act play, actually, a lot of things we see, a lot of things we read, a lot of plays we watch have this structure. There's a setup at the beginning. There's a plot point 1 that makes a major change between the first section and the third section. And it usually says, okay, things were pretty good. Plot point 1, things got real bad. Something happened that changed things, all right? The next one, there's this middle ground of confrontation trying to make a resolution. Then there's something that makes that change again towards the end, and then there is a resolution and things are good again. And usually the movie tries to tell you that, or the book tries to tell you that things are better than they used to be. I'm going to give you a couple of simple ones first. You ever watch Dudley Do-Right? It was a cartoon back in the late 60s. Did you ever see it? I have a whole group. Nobody has seen Dudley Do-Right. All right. The whole idea of Dudley Do-Right, this was on with Rocky and Bowling. Okay, it was one of the segments on the Rocky and Bowling show. And it always followed the same format. Dudley Do-Right was a cartoon, and this was the plot. Dudley expressed his feelings for Nell. I love you, Nell. All right. Snidely Whiplash captured Nell and was going to kill her. Dudley Do-Right comes back to save her and saves the day. But the running joke in it was at the very end, she'd always turn and she liked the horse better than Dudley.
I think I,
Right? Huh?
I think I've seen this.
Yeah?
Maybe.
So it basically follows this 3-act play. Dudley Do-Right likes Nell, gives her flowers, Snidely captures her. That's the beginning of the bad part. The bad part is Snidely is about to do away with Nell. She is on the tracks, and you can hear the trains coming. And then Snidely rides, whoops, I put the wrong word in there. Dudley rides to the rescue. And then finally, instead of happily ever after, she's happily ever after with the horse. Now I want you to listen to this very carefully. This was the theme that was played before every Dudley Do-Right cartoon. They were short segments. They were probably 5 minutes. They were very long. But I want you to see if you can tell from the music that there's a happy time, there's something that changes, and there's a dangerous, dastardly deeds, and then there's a better time at the end. Right? You ready? Let's turn this up so I make sure you can hear it, because I don't know what the sound level is here. All right. Listen for all three. Change. Change. Things are better, even better than before. You see how the music went? The music was telling you the story before the story ever began. Right? That's the basis of many three-act plays. So, what about Cinderella? Same thing. We have Cinderella with her dad. That's the happy time. Then he marries the stepmother and the ugly sisters, and then he dies. Things get bad, right? And she has to do all the work. Things look really grim. And then what happens? Right? Enter Prince Charming. Not right away, but by the end, things are better than they were before. Right? Same structure. This is not just true of fairy tales. This is true of most every movie that you watch. Unless it's a very modern movie that's trying not to do this on purpose. Okay? The thing I'm going to try to show you is the Bible is a three-act play. But you have to look at it from Genesis through Revelation and read it as one continuous story in order to understand that. All right? That's very important. Too often, this is how we look at the Bible. We look at it as a reference set of books. Okay? If you want to know something about history, then you go to the history section. All right? The Torah. You can't see some of this down here, but Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts would be the history section. The Kings and Joshua, Judges through the Kings, etc., would be the history section. If you wanted to know the books of wisdom, then you'd go to Psalms and Proverbs and Song of Solomon, that sort of thing. So we use it almost like a phone book. We want to know something, we go to Accordance, flip through it. That's the way we're taught, and that's wrong. We shouldn't be taught the Bible that way. It's good, in a way, to look at the Bible that way so that we know where stuff is, but that's not how we should be taught the Bible. We're taught the Bible as a phone book when the Bible is actually a novel. It's actually a story. We need to be taught it as a story. In fact, it's an extremely long story. That's the storyline of the Bible. And we're going to get more into that in detail later on. All right? But we start out with creation and we end with, up here in Christ's time and afterwards. But this is the entire story of the Bible laid out. We've got to know why that's the case. So how is the Bible a three-act play? That's my next question. What would be the beginning setup, the beginning scene of this big, long, several thousand years, from the beginning of time until the end of the New Testament? When would be the setup in the Bible? If we looked at the part of the Bible, that's the setup, that's the beginning. What would it be?
Maybe before we get the fruit and sin started?
That's brilliant. That is actually exactly what it is. It's Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Okay? Does it describe things as being good? Yeah, over and over again. God did this, and it was good. God did this, and it was good. God did this, and it was good. And then he created man, and he looked at it, and he said, this is very good. And then chapter 2, he describes things like marriage. He describes what the creation of Eve. He describes what the world looks like with all the different gems and emeralds, and that the garden was watered in a way that they had plenty of food to eat. They could eat from all the trees that they wanted to except one, and there was a tree of life there that they could last forever. So the next thing is, what made the change? What's the plot point 1 of the Bible?
Be the fall. The fruit.
In chapter 3. Absolutely. The entrance of the serpent, the prediction of the promised seed, who was going to eventually be the Son. All right? That's where the plot point changes things for the worst, because they were thrown out of the garden. And then there has to be this plan implemented all the way through to get to the plot point 2 at the end, which we're going to talk about in just a second. So this next part is, the middle part is the bulk of the Bible. It starts in Genesis chapter 4 and sees how things go downhill. Okay? Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. Cain's descendants. His lineage in the Bible ends with a guy that murders for pleasure. And we've got the Tower of Babel where people were against God. We've got the flood. We've got the problems as God sets up the kingdom of Israel. We've got the problems that happen throughout the kingdom and how they go away from God. And so this is the middle section, which is usually the longest section of any play, where the conflict has to be resolved. All right? So what's plot point 2? The thing that changes things back again. Just begins to make that change.
What would it be when he died on the cross first?
It'd be the whole time period of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Okay? That's what makes that change. Now, in this part, that seed was promised back in Genesis, first promised back in Genesis chapter 3:15. And there are hints and clues, as we're going to talk about in some of this class, all the way through the entire books of the New Testament that lead to pointing who this is. It's filled with it. In fact, that's what the whole Old Testament is really about. It's trying to figure out who this mystery character is, this seed is. But once he comes and he does die, what happens next? Act 3 culminates with Jesus' return. The battle is being fought and the victory is sure. That's what the end of the Bible tells us. The story's not quite done yet. The story won't be totally done until Jesus does return. But we know that it's done. And things are going to be better because now there's going to be a tree of life on either side of the river. Now we're going to live with God. The Bible is a 3-act play. All right? And we need to view it that way. And once you do, and you really understand that, you're never going to want to go back to understanding it as segmented again, like what we too often taught. Here's the problem. It was written over 1,500 years span of time. It had 40 different authors. The authors didn't know each other. A few of them did, but most of them didn't know each other. The authors did not live at the same time. Yet all of the 66 pieces that are in there tell that story. How could that happen? By accident. It tells a story from beginning to end, and the end hasn't even happened yet. It claims to be true, like we just said, and claims to be the source of truth, as if it was written by one author. That's kind of profound when you think about it that way. Is there any modern piece of literature or movie or anything that we can look at that compares to this? Yeah, there actually is. Star Wars. And I'm not talking about Star Wars as what its themes are. I'm talking about its structure. Kind of get what I'm talking about sometimes. All right? So, Star Wars was originally going to be put out in 3 different sections of 3. Did they start from the beginning in the first group? No, they didn't, did they? All right? In fact, for a guy like me, I started watching Star Wars by the time I was 25, and they dribbled them out every 2-3 years, and then there was like a long gap. Well, it wasn't until I was like 40 that they put out that second group. Guess what I did? I forgot all of it. All right? I'm 40 years old. I got a lot of things that happened from the time I was 25. So I really didn't watch it very much, but I was kind of interested. I always wanted to know. Well, here a couple of years ago, I sat down during the winter and I found every one of the episodes and I put them in order. And I watched it from beginning to end. All right? So, The first one should have been, was put out in 1999, the second one 2002, the third one in 2005. Then there was an intermediate one in 2016, and then another one in 2016, and then episode 4 had been already done back in 1977. And then 1980, and then 1983. And then it wasn't until after this group up here that we have the 2015, 17, and 19, and that's them in order. And if you watch it from beginning to end, it finally makes sense.
They didn't do it that way.
They did. And there's lots of reasons why. I can tell you some reasons why I think he did it that way. Some of them are good reasons, because he couldn't start out with a little kid and then have that kid make sure. This took 48 years.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? How could you do that and make sure that the kid was going to, number one, be alive 48 years later, make sure that he wanted to even be an actor, all right? So he couldn't do it that way. But there's some other reasons, too, that I think are important. So when we look at this sort of thing, we can compare it to the Bible and how the Bible is written. God conceives of a story in the Bible long before man was ever aware. It was executed and written over 1,000 years altogether. It was not always in chronological order. I mean, the kings happen here, but the prophecies are placed at the end of the book. But a lot of those prophets wrote during the time of the kings. So if you just read the kings and then you read the prophets separately, you don't fully understand what the prophets were prophesying about. So in that sense, it's not even always exactly in our Bibles the same order as what it actually happened. You have to work at figuring that out. It was only understood fully when you are extremely familiar with all its parts. God reveals himself throughout the entire book. And the major theme of a promised seed or a son is first introduced in Genesis chapter 3 and then clarified page by page. Who did you think throughout the entire series the possibilities for the Savior was in Star Wars? I mean, Skywalker, Obi-Wan, I can't remember the other guy's name.
Anakin?
Yeah, there's all different kinds of them. But it wasn't until the very end who was the actual savior of it. It was an obscure lady who was, I think, Luke Skywalker's niece, called
Ray.
Ray.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a surprise at the end. That's kind of the way it was with the Bible. Think about it. The people at Jesus' time, most of them didn't even understand, even though all the signs pointed towards it being Jesus, they still didn't get it. And it's only in retrospect now that we actually can study this book as a story and know that's what the whole Old Testament was talking about. That's how this book is written. That's how this book is laid out. It's not laid out the same as the Quran, the book of Islam. It's not laid out the same as the Vedas, the book of the Hindus. It's not laid out the same way as Buddhism or Shinto or any other major religion. And we're going to talk about some of those religions and compare them to the Bible. None of these other world religions tell one long, uninterrupted story of the course of all of man's history. And like before, we're going to look at the evidences that show, hopefully, to you guys, that it is the Bible and only the Bible that is the believable truth, and the other sources that people cling to are not. That's what the second half of this class is going to be about.